Thank you. I'm going to explain to you the way that this debate is going to run. So the candidates are going to give a 3-minute opening statement. And we've picked straws, and Mr. Johnson is going first, so we'll have a 3-minute opening statement. After that, we will have questions, and each candidate is allowed 1 minute to answer the question. And I'm going to give a question that both of them get to answer. In addition, if either of them choose, there will be a 30-second rebuttal time that's allowed. At the end of all the questions, when my wife says it's time to shut this off, they are going to have a 1.5 minutes each to do a closing statement. So, gentlemen, are you ready?
Ready.
Awesome. So our straws were drawn, and Governor Johnson is going to go first with his 3-minute statement.
So my father is 96 years old, and he was with the 101st Airborne Division. He paratrooped into Normandy before D-Day. And if you saw a band of brothers that followed the 101st through all this, my father lost a lung in the Battle of the Bulge, and he got bayoneted in the back. So a sacrifice that none of us have been called upon to do, but thank you very much. I believe in smaller government. I believe that the government is too big, it tries to accomplish too much, it taxes too much, and so it takes money away from you and I, that you and I would do better at spending that money than the government does. I also believe in civil liberties. I think that civil liberties are really important. I think that individual freedom and liberty is a cornerstone of our lives, and that we should be allowed to do things that you and I deem we should be able to do, having the liberty and freedom to be able to do that. Now, if that infringes on others, if that potentially does harm to others, that's not acceptable. I believe in entrepreneurship. I believe that everybody should pursue being an entrepreneur. I see the model of the future as Uber everything, eliminating the middleman, allowing money to flow directly to you and I as the deliverers of those goods and services. Airbnb, this is the model of the future. And I believe that our military interventions in this world have not made the world a safer place, that they've made the world less safe. Are they responsible for Islamic terrorism? No, but they're not helping. So when it comes to boots on the ground, when it comes to dropping bombs, when it comes to drone strikes that are killing thousands of innocent civilians, this is not the way to deal with the very real threat that is out there, which is Islamic terrorism. We need to contain Islamic terrorism in the Middle East. We need to cut off the funding to these organizations. And we can do that. I was governor of New Mexico for 2 terms. It was an opportunity that I was given. I made a name for myself vetoing legislation. I may have said no to government more than the other 49 governors in the country combined. So when you're looking at a change agent, not only am I espousing change, but I've delivered change. I had thousands of line item vetoes as governor of New Mexico. I took line item veto to an entire new art form. When it came to civil liberties, the ACLU graded all of the presidential candidates in the 2012 race, and I had the highest score with 21 Liberty Torches. Ron Paul was second with 18, Barack Obama was third with 16, and Newt Gingrich, Mitt Romney, Mitt Romney, and Rick Santorum, 1 Liberty Torch between the 3 of them.
Thank you very much. Our next candidate is Austin Pedersen, and he is going to be sharing with us his 3 minutes.
Hello everyone, I'm Austin Peterson. I'm the son of Missouri landscapers. I was born in Independence, raised on a horse farm in Peculiar, just a short drive from a town called Liberty. Coincidence? I'll let you be the judge of that. I have always been a libertarian. I learned about economic freedom by planting chrysanthemums in the fields when I was a young man, and going into my small town and selling them to the people of Peculiar. I learned about social liberty from those who taught me that you should do unto others as you would have them do unto you. Basically, that our policies should come out of a position of love for one another. And that's what I believe libertarianism is all about. It's all about loving and trusting one another, because freedom means that we trust one another. It means that our freedom should be as expansive as possible, because that means that people are good. That's how our system of dynamic free market capitalism works. Now, I haven't always been in politics. I actually was a musical theater major and a playwright, and I was an accomplished one for a number of years until I got sideways with the IRS, and I started seeing what my income taxes were living in New York City after I graduated from college, and they were enormous. And it was just when I was starting to make a name for myself and starting to make a living that the government was coming in and cutting into that. So I started watching the Republican debates in 2007, and I thought maybe Rudy Giuliani would be my guy, until he got destroyed by a 72-year-old OBGYN named Ron Paul. And I knew that that was my guy. So I took my 12 best buddies, and we went downtown in Manhattan, and we started an activist group, and we took those 12 guys and turned them into 1,200 people and raised $1 million for Dr. Ron Paul. Now, that was just the beginning. The LP took a notice and they said, "Hey Austin, you want to bring some of that magic to us?" So I moved to Washington, D.C., and I became your volunteer coordinator at your national office. I turned that national office into a powerhouse of activism. It was silent when I got there, but when I was gone, we had a thriving hubbub of activism. These are the kinds of rock star qualities I want to bring to your ticket. While I was there, I brainchilded the project that got Judge Andrew Napolitano his own show on Fox. And I did that while at the LP office. I want to do that kind of stuff again. I went to Fox, I worked for the judge, I was his A1 producer for a couple of years. He called me the right side of his brain, and utterly fearless because I made so much trouble for the neocons and the Social Democrats. I did get in a lot of trouble. I'm a bit of a troublemaker, but only for the bad guys, because I'm sort of a freedom fighter. I consider myself a warrior for these ideas. And I've been fighting every single day for the last 10 years for these ideas. I worked very hard to support Governor Johnson's ticket in 2012, and I worked very hard for Ron Paul's ticket as well. Now I'm fighting to be your liberty champion, because I think that if you give me this nomination, then I'm going to bring the fire and the passion for limited government that I have amongst my audience, which is 1 million people a month, and I'm going to bring that to the national ticket. I hope you will nominate me, and I can prove that to you tonight.
Thank you. The next question, you can basically decide which one of you wants to go first, but Mr. Peterson, this will be open to you if you want to go first. There were two questions that were very similar. Basically, they want to know, everyone is either promoting Bernie or they are saying we have no choice except Hillary or Trump. How can we show people otherwise? And this other question, which is very similar to it, says, assuming the LP candidate is not invited to the debate, which I'm not sure which debate they're talking about, how will your candidate photo and statement send a message that will garner at least 5% of the vote?
Every single day, I call dozens and dozens of people. I've been calling thousands of people, not only just to fundraise, but also to connect directly with the American people. We have great advances in technology that give the libertarians the ability to connect to the average voters like we could never before. Now, we need to be able to poll to get into those debates. We need to be polling high enough, or hopefully, if Governor Johnson's suit is successful, one of us will be in the presidential debates on the basis of that lawsuit. I think that what we need to do is we need to get back to grassroots 101. It's all about connecting with voters. So we can go around the mainstream media. I think the mainstream media is going to take some notice in us, but they don't understand who we are or what we are. So we've got to be better salesmen of what it is that we're trying to accomplish. We have got to be better at selling Liberty 101 to people. It's all about rhetoric. It's all about how you communicate these ideas. The problem with libertarianism is not with our principles. It's simply with how they're being sold. And I talk to thousands right now. I don't know how many hundreds of people are watching right now, but this is the future. This is how we're going to win, because if the two parties don't give us the option, it's right there. The people are there and they're listening right now.
Thank you, Mr. Peterson.
Johnson.
Me? Yes, please.
So yesterday, there was a national poll that had my name alongside of Hillary's and Trump's. That's the first time that that's ever happened. and I was at 11%. Now, that probably could have been any name. If Mickey Mouse would have been on that poll, he'd have probably polled 28%, but it happened. And the threshold for, there is no way a third party wins without being in the presidential debates. It's just not going to happen. So the threshold for being in the presidential debates is 15%, and that's set up by the Presidential Debate Commission, which are made up of Republicans and Democrats, and they do everything it is they can to exclude a third party from being in the presidential debates. I'm suing the Presidential Debate Commission right now on the basis of if you're on the ballot in enough states to mathematically be elected, 270 electoral votes, then you should be included in the national debates. Now, that will be whomever the Libertarian nominee is.
Thank you very much, Commissioner. The next question is about a contradiction about beliefs. As an atheist, libertarian objectivist, I wonder how you reconcile your religious beliefs with the core libertarian principles. Governor Johnson, would you like to try that?
Well, I was raised as a Christian, a Lutheran, and the takeaway that I have from my Christian upbringing is that do unto others as you would have others do unto you. And that's the way that I have lived my life. I have also politically tried as well as I possibly can to separate church and state, that there needs to be a separation there, and that we do have religious freedom. We need to recognize a religious freedom, but that there is a separation between government and religion.
There's nothing more beautiful than the freedom of religion, and that's why so many people come to the United States, is because they can come here and they can practice. The first colonists came here because they were fleeing religious persecution. And so I will always defend religious freedom here in the United States. I think that is of utmost importance and fundamental to our Constitution. I was raised a Southern Baptist. When my mother passed away when I was very young, I lost my faith. But it strengthened in me the belief that we need religious liberty because of my non-faith. And I'm not afraid to say what it is that I believe, because I want to always speak to the heart of what it is, why I believe what I believe. My philosophical viewpoints come from a strictly logical, rational viewpoint that you discussed. I'm not an objectivist per se, but I do believe that liberty comes from a natural understanding of our fundamental rights, that every human is endowed with the same right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. You know, if you look at the foundation, the founders actually were split down the middle in terms of their religious beliefs. But we were founded on Judeo-Christian principles, and many of those principles I do hold very dear to myself.
Thank you very much. Our next question is about national security and personal freedom. Of course, with the recent terrorist attack in Belgium, this is a hot topic. The Patriot Act and laws like it are intended to protect the United States. Do they? And at what price? Likewise, would you support or veto a bill like the Patriot Act if you were president?
They who would give up temporary liberty for safety deserve neither. The reality is that the government cannot keep us safe. They couldn't keep us safe on 9/11. You know, you know what makes America safe? The Second Amendment is what makes us safe. Nobody comes and messes with us because we have the right to bear arms. We need to strengthen that fundamental right. Now, I don't run around in fear of terrorism at night. Frankly, you've got a better chance of dying in a bathtub. If you want to fight terrorism, fight it constitutionally. The founders gave us these tools for us to fight terrorism. You either go to war with a declaration of war and you obey the Constitution, and that comes through Congress, not the executive, or you go all Jeffersonian on them and you fight them like Thomas Jefferson did. He fought his Islamic terrorists using letters of marque and reprisal. There are thousands and thousands of grizzled veterans of wars in the United States who are just itching to do the world a favor. Unleash them. Ron Paul wanted to do it after 9/11. He issued a legislation that would have allowed us to go after these people. This is how we fight it. Use the Constitution and do not give up our civil rights. No Patriot Act and no warrantless wiretaps.
So I have a political arm, our America Initiative, and we've been more outspoken regarding the Patriot Act perhaps than any other organization, writing editorials constantly about the Patriot Act and the infringement that it poses to all of us. As governor of New Mexico, I would have never, ever established the Department of Homeland Security. I think it's incredibly redundant. I would have never established the TSA. I would have left that up to the airports, to the municipalities, to the states, as opposed to the federal government. This metadata that is being collected, there is due process. We do have a constitution. We do have the Fourth Amendment. But granting Verizon or granting the government the power to monitor 110 million Verizon users, I have to tell you, I think that this goes way over the line. And where is the spokesperson for this? I believe I've provided that voice. Thank you.
Our next question was directed specifically at you, Governor Johnson. What is your specific stance on the non-aggression principle?
Well, I believe in the non-aggression principle. Now, is it contrary to parts of the Constitution? I think when it comes to taxes, yes, it certainly is. And you know what? I'm looking to abolish the IRS. I'm looking to abolish income tax and corporate tax. So working within the system to, if you will, bring the Constitution in line with the non-aggression principle. And then the non-aggression principle certainly has been violated by the government when it comes to the arrest and incarceration, conviction of nonviolent, victimless drug crime. And no one politically has been more outspoken on this than me. In 1999, I was the highest elected official in the United States to call for the legalization of marijuana. I think that that's good news. In 2016, I'm still the highest ranking elected official in the country to call for the legalization of marijuana, although I guess Bernie is doing the same thing. I guess he fell out of bed, hit his head. I'm glad he did.
Would you like to respond, Mr. Peterson, in any way?
Yeah, don't hurt people, don't take their stuff. It's really that simple, and that's the kind of thing that I want to teach to my kids, that's for sure. In terms of what is the non-aggression principle, there is a bit of a hullabaloo in the Libertarian Party. People would be very upset with me if I didn't talk about it. This is an intellectual discussion, and it's one that we need to have. It's the question of, do we want to have a large group of people, or do we want to keep our party small in a debate club? I want it to be open to everyone. I mean, I sort of get hazed every single day because I'm attracting Marco Rubio supporters to the party. And I mean, these are the kind of people that we've always been like, oh, these are the horrible neocons. They're now coming to our party because they see me as the constitutionalist. And like Governor Johnson said, there are many parts of the Constitution which do not fall in line with the non-aggression principle. The goal is to go towards that type of a society we want to live in. But the reality is, do we believe we can achieve a utopia on Earth? Only communists sell that kind of idea. That's BS. We need to be pushing a realistic vision of liberty to the American people, one that we can accomplish. The Constitution is our guide. It's not perfect, but we should try and find ways to bring the Constitution in line with those libertarian principles, which I think most of us do agree with.
Thank you. The next question was addressed to Mr. Peterson. However, I have more than one question about this, and it relates to open borders. What's your philosophy? What would you do as president about our borders?
Well, we already have open borders in the United States. What we really are talking about here is how hard do we want to make it for people to become American citizens? I mean, we all love America. We all want people, the people who try and come here are coming here because, not because they want welfare or handouts. If they wanted that, they'd go to Europe. They come here to the United States because they know that they can work hard and they can make a living. The reality is that nobody is speaking up on the behalf of the consumers, because when migrant workers come here, we benefit from cheaper prices. So the question here is, how much do you want to pay for a cheeseburger? Do you want to pay $10 for a cheeseburger? I sure don't. I want to support a simple path to naturalization. We should have worker visas, we should have student visas, so that people will have an opportunity to come here legally. Right now, we incentivize people to come here illegally. I want us to go back towards a more simple Ellis Island styled policy, like how my Peterson family came here. They got a simple disease check, they had a simple security check, and that was it. I'm not afraid of open borders, but I will obey the Constitution and the law if I win the presidency.
Thank you very much.
Immigration is really a good thing. We're a country of immigrants. So we should make it as easy as possible for somebody that wants to come into this country and work to be able to get a work visa. I'm not talking about a green card, I'm not talking about citizenship, I'm talking about a work visa that should entail a background check and a social security card that applicable taxes get paid. Building a fence across the border, I think, is absolutely crazy. Look, Mexicans are not coming over the border taking US jobs. They're coming over and taking jobs that US citizens don't want. And when it comes to pay, it's not an issue of pay unless there's an issue of language. And when there's an issue of language, yes, there's less pay, but Mexicans are the first ones that recognize this and are working hard to overcome that, which they do. And they are hardworking. The notion that they are murderers and rapists, the fact is, immigrants that are coming across the border are much more compliant with US law than US citizens.
Thank you. Shifting gears, the next question is about presidential proposals of measures. Article 2, Section 3 states, "He shall from time to time give to Congress information of the state of the Union and recommend to consideration such measures as he shall judge necessary and expedient." What measures would you propose to Congress in your first term and why?
I think the biggest threat facing this country right now is our debt, is the fact that we spend too much money. That 20 cents out of every dollar that we're currently spending is borrowed, is printed. So I would propose a balanced budget to Congress. That's what I would do. And that would be a 20% reduction in government spending. I really think that there is a negative implication to continuing to spend more money than what we take in. To cut government spending by 20% is unprecedented, but it involves the entitlements. It involves Medicaid and Medicare. I believe that we could devolve health care to the states, 50 laboratories of best practice. We would absolutely have best practice when it comes to the delivery of health care to those over 65 and those on welfare. And by the way, I'm talking about states doing this, not the federal government, when it comes to Medicare. And then military spending. You got to take this on. It's a 20% reduction in military spending, but that only goes back a handful of years to have to accomplish that.
Thank you.
So one of the most important themes that I try and press in my nomination, seeking of the nomination, is the powers of the presidency, checks and balances. And the president actually doesn't have the authority over the powers of the purse. That's a congressional responsibility. Of course, we can ask the Congress to act, but they aren't always going to do what we say. But there are some things that the president can accomplish unilaterally that would be libertarian and would be legal. You could actually, as president of the United States, end the federal war on drugs by instructing the head of the DEA to set the drug schedule to 0. So you could effectively eliminate the department, the DEA, by setting the drug schedules to 0. That way it removes the ability of the DEA to enforce the federal war on drugs. This kicks the war on drugs back to the states so that the federal government no longer has any authority over this. Now, there are some problems associated with federalism that we have to discuss. Texas might execute you for looking at a joint. California might make it mandatory to wake and bake. So there are some problems. But I don't believe that the federal government should have the authority to regulate it, and I would direct my DEA chief to set all drugs to 0 and end the war on drugs day 1.
Sticking with the Constitution, Article 2, Section 1 states that the President shall at stated times receive for his services a compensation, which shall neither be increased nor diminished during the period for which he shall have been elected. and he shall not receive within that period any other emolument from the United States or any of them. The U.S. taxpayers have footed the bill for an extraordinary amount of trips and vacations around the world that have cost tens of millions of dollars for the president and his family. Does this violate the above quoted section, and would you continue the same lavish lifestyle if elected?
Well, whether or not it gets crossways with the Constitution or not, I want you to know that I am the most frugal guy that you have ever met. Now, there's a difference between being frugal and cheap. I'm not cheap, but I'm very frugal. And I want to tell you, I got to be governor of New Mexico. The governor of New Mexico had a $120,000 expense account every year for decades prior to my, let's say at least a decade prior to my taking office. I cut that number down to $20,000. Air Force One needs to be grounded. The president makes these lavish trips, and this is not the example that we want to set, especially if we're talking about this country coming in line with spending. So as governor of New Mexico, I led this charge on I have to set the example when it comes to spending, and I have to set the example when it comes to spending in my own office. So I did that and would do that as President of the United States.
I have built a national campaign, a viable presidential campaign on less money than most people run for Congress on. And I've crossed the entire United States in my van with my entire staff, who are all working for me unpaid because they love liberty. Because I draw people to me who are in this, not for the love of money or for the love of power. The type of people who are attracted to me and who would work in my administration would do it because they love this country and because they love this Constitution. Now, when it comes to being fiscally responsible, I have not spent one single dime into debt on this presidential campaign, and I have forced a nationally televised debate that's historic, that didn't cost me a dime. I have a national infrastructure, regional directors, state directors all across the entire country, all working because they believe in me and because they believe in this message. If I'm president of the United States, I don't need all of that, all of the emoluments of office, because I'm a very simple man. I grew up on a farm. I like shooting my AR-15 that I built, and I like hanging out with my girlfriend in my truck on the weekends. So I don't really need all of that stuff. So no, I will not be spending millions of dollars on vacations because, you know, America's good enough for me.
Our next question is about civil forfeiture. This has become big business among law enforcement agencies throughout the federal government as well as the states. Would you abolish or remove the incentive to police for profit?
The law is perverted, and the police powers of the state are perverted along with it. Frederick Bastiat had it right. I'll tell you what, ladies and gentlemen, when you have policing for profit, you have open, rampant corruption. If I am president of the United States, I will make sure that every single enforcement agency under my purview will fall in line with the Constitution. They go out and they, if you have more than $10,000 in cash in your wallet, they can confiscate it and take it, and then you have to sue to try and get it back. And if you're lucky, if you do get it back. This is a complete abrogation of our civil rights and our economic liberties. Libertarians must stand up against this injustice. I will work with the attorneys at the Institute for Justice who are fantastic on this. These are the most libertarian litigators in the country. That is ground zero for the fight for liberty, and we as libertarians must all stand together against this abrogation of our civil liberties and our civil rights.
So I didn't mention either that I'm probably the biggest failure that you've ever met also, meaning I've made a lot of mistakes in my life. And one of the mistakes that I made was that in my first year in office as governor, they presented an asset forfeiture bill, and I drank the Kool-Aid, the fact that law enforcement needed those tools. Now, after a couple of years in office, I realized that I had drank that Kool-Aid. I learned from my mistake, and I did get another crack at that legislation, and in fact, sign that legislation. asset forfeiture is theft. Asset forfeiture is the worst that government is. It's government by force. It's taking what it is that you have with literally no proof whatsoever to have to obtain those assets. So, mistake on my part, lucky enough to be able to correct it.
Our next question is about nominations for specifically the Supreme Court. How do you view the current controversy about the appointment of a Supreme Court justice, and what sort of judge would you select for confirmation?
Well, I think the Republicans should consider the nomination. I mean, I think it's President Obama's constitutional duty to present that nominee, that he has done that. I think it's wrong that the Republicans aren't considering the nominee. As governor of New Mexico, I got to make 100 judicial appointments, and those appointments had to do with, in this case, people that quit the office as judges, got sick. Sometimes it was scandal, but I had the opportunity to make appointments when it came to judges. I really prided myself. There was no criteria whatsoever to appointing a judge other than someone that was obviously honest, that had a brain, that had a process for thinking. One of my favorite questions was, would you implement the death penalty for graffiti? If the legislature passed that legislation, I signed it, and the Supreme Court upheld that it was constitutional, would you implement the death penalty? The wrong answer was, yes, I would implement I would implement that no matter what. The right answer was, I would resign. I would resign because that would be so against my beliefs to have to implement that law.
So I'm a bit of a warrior, and when your enemies grant you no quarter, I say grant them none as well. The Republicans are doing a great job, and they need to fight as hard as they can, because I hope, Governor, if you win, that you will get to pick the next Supreme Court nominee. I've been looking at a slate of officials. One person who you might not be familiar with, I hope that I can get you interested in. His name is Randy Barnett. He is a professor at Georgetown. He's written some of the best stuff in regards to our Second Amendment rights. He wrote a lot of the anti-Obamacare arguments. They filed an amicus brief. Please take a look into Mr. Barnett and learn more from him. He's one of the best libertarians we have. My former boss, Judge Napolitano, would be an amazing pick. I would love to see him in there. Actually, I'll tell you a really funny story. I said, Judge, would you like to be Attorney General? And he's like, no, I want to be on the Supreme Court. And I said, well, Judge, I go, don't you want to end the war on drugs? He's like, you just want to get high with your friends. I'm like, no, Judge, I really want you to end the war on drugs. But I think he'd be a fantastic pick. Randy Barnett would be a great pick. And there are a couple of senators that I've spoken to as well.
I'm going to change the rules for this next question. We're going to limit it to 30 seconds, and the reason it's pretty open-ended question. How can a person be honest and win?
I did it. I did it as governor of New Mexico, and the notion of telling the truth. It's extremely difficult to do any harm to somebody who's willing to tell the truth, regardless of the consequences. And it worked amazingly well. Good government is easy. It's not hard.
I really have nothing to hide. I have no special interests. There are no industries who have come in to support me. I have been born on the backs of angels. Hundreds and hundreds of donors have been committing their pocket change and their change jars at the top of the refrigerators to send me around the country on this mission to fight for these liberties. And again, I have nothing to hide. I'm a very common man. I come from humble roots, and I've kicked down the doors of power in Washington, D.C. and New York. So it's very simple. Most of the people know a lot about me, because if you want to know anything about me, I'll answer it right here live to my screen. This is the future of politics. Pure transparency. This is what I'm offering the American people. I'll be live streaming from the Oval Office next year. I hope you all tune in.
Thank you. President Obama has summarily refused to enforce certain laws. Does this violate the Constitution, and should a president be prosecuted for such an offense?
The founders knew that it was impossible for the president to enforce all of the laws. The president does have the authority to pick and choose in certain ways. Of course, there are some laws that are higher priority than others. The laws in regards to the federal crimes that might necessarily endanger national security. Those do have to be prosecuted. But you simply cannot round up every single illegal immigrant in the country without creating a totalitarian police state. So it's important that we have a president who has good guidance, who can make good judgment, and choosing which laws he can enforce based on the budgetary constraints. You have to understand that in order for us to budget for it, the president isn't going to get the money to enforce all of the laws. So I think it's naive to assume that you could possibly enforce all of them. It's a political ploy that the Republicans and Democrats use on one another to say, oh, he's not following this law. Well, they didn't say that 4 years ago. They didn't say that 8 years ago when Bush was in office. So again, it's a political ploy. We need to educate ourselves on what the president's authority truly is.
So the oath of office is to uphold the laws of the land, the Constitution, and if I were elected president and took that oath, yes, I would look to enforce the laws that we have. In that context, the President of the United States runs the federal government. Governor of the state runs state government. In that context, if you've got a president that wants smaller government, if you want a president that is going to provide transparency, if you have a president that is looking out for individual liberty and freedom at every juncture, you're going to get it. You're going to get it with me as President of the United States, but I'm going to uphold the laws.
So we're back to the 1-minute answers if you so choose. Executive orders. Nowhere in the Constitution are executive orders mentioned. Thus, they are neither commended nor prohibited. However, this type of instrument appears to be being abused. How would you use executive orders, and how would you deal with past executive orders that are still standing?
So you want to review every executive order to make sure that it's in line with the Constitution, and those which are not, or those which violate civil rights or overstep the power of the executive branch should be done away with. But there are some ways that you can use them constitutionally and legally to advance libertarian ideas. Many of the programs that we have in the federal government are simply grants. The National Science Foundation, the National Foundation Endowment for the Arts, for example. And many of these programs, the president writes the administrative law, in a sense. It's not the law, the Congress writes a law, but he writes how that law is enforced using executive order. So you could simply direct the National Endowment for the Arts not to spend any money on grants that year. And that's a way that you could actually cut the budget and do so constitutionally in line with our principles. So those are the kinds of solutions that I would find that I think would not violate my oath of office and would allow us to expand liberty here in the United States.
So as the executive orders are part of being the executive. I mean, you have to issue orders for the federal government to actually operate. In the case of state government, you have to issue executive orders to your cabinet as to how things take place. In New Mexico, the legislature really, so if you've got a president that is bent on reducing the size of government and bent on seeing individual freedom and liberty prevail, you're going to get that with a president who's going to issue executive orders to also make that take place. I know that in New Mexico, the legislature refused to cut government to the extent that I wanted government cut. So basically what we did is we took the money that the legislature gave us and we just banked it in all the agencies. That when I left office, there was literally $1 billion worth of monies in these agency accounts. It got spent, by the way, very quickly when my success.
Article 5 of the U.S. Constitution provides that on application of the legislatures of 2/3 of the several states, they shall call a convention for proposing amendments. Do we need a constitutional convention of the states to remedy our current problems?
Two things. One is, I do believe that there is a silver bullet out there when it comes to the system, and it's term limits. So that would require a constitutional amendment, term limits. I think that if we had term limits, I think politicians would do the right thing, as opposed to whatever it takes to get reelected. So that is something that I would do. When it comes to a constitutional convention, I would love to repeal the 17th Amendment of this country, that if we never had the 17th Amendment in this country, which allows for the direct election of U.S. senators as opposed to the appointment of U.S. senators, that we would not be in the fiscal situation that we're in today. That if senators were accountable to their states, in no way would they be spending the money that they're spending without the accountability that would go along with being appointed by state legislatures.
I'm very much in agreement with the governor on term limits, absolutely, as well as the 17th Amendment and the 16th Amendment. I'm glad he brought it up, because if you didn't know, the progressive era culminated in the early 1900s, but historically in the late 1800s, the progressive movement began. And what socialists did was they pushed for an Article 5 convention. And the elites who held power at the time did not want an Article 5 convention. That was the last thing that they wanted, because they knew that there was a chance that the entire Constitution could be rewritten. The mere threat of a constitutional convention is what led to the passage of the 16th and the 17th Amendments. So it's not the actual constitutional convention that we may want, because that could be dangerous. The progressives and the statist conservatives could use that to abrogate our rights completely and to abolish the Bill of Rights. But the threat of a constitutional convention is what sometimes brings about change. We need to look at that historically. Because theoretically, if we were to unify nationally and push for a constitutional convention, we might get that constitutional amendment that Governor Johnson has spoken of, and we might get term limits. So let's push for it.
So I agree with Austin on the constitutional amendment to allow for income tax. As part of my proposal to eliminate income tax and corporate tax would be repeal of the amendment that allows that.
Mr. Peterson, would you like to add anything?
Right, so of course, Governor, your tax plan is one to have a national sales tax, which I disagree with. I think that harms the poor and the middle class the most, because poor and middle class for a consumption tax, I'm middle class, we pay more of our salaries for essential goods and services that we go and we buy. The rich don't pay as much of their income, a portion of their income. So a sales tax hurts the poor and the middle class more. I definitely want to abolish the income tax the same way, but I think we need to move to cut taxes right now on the road to moving the income tax and replacing it with nothing, no income tax whatsoever.
I think we have a debate going here.
Well, if anybody can make eliminating income tax and corporate tax and replacing it with nothing stick, it's me. But I don't think the Congress is going to go along with that. So I think that a very, very logical way to do that is to propose a consumption tax. I'm saying that you could use the fair tax, and I hate to use the term fair tax, but I think you could use the fair tax as a template, just a template for how to dot the I's and cross the T's to accomplish one national sales tax.
Okay, you're entitled to a rebuttal, but I have a question that goes right along with this, if you indulge me.
Go ahead.
Pretty much everybody hates the IRS and our complex tax code. How would you change it, or what would you replace it with?
Nothing. People always ask, they say, Austin, well, what are you going to do if you don't have an income tax? Well, the government will be smaller, so we won't need an income tax. You know, the founders didn't pass an income tax. There's nothing in this Constitution about an income tax. No unapportioned taxes was what they laid. And you know, they were the type of people who knew that you needed to do more with less. So when they needed a road, who will build the roads? When they needed a road, George Washington got off his butt on Mount Vernon, he signed a lottery, and he raised money to build a road. He did that himself. He did that personally. He didn't go out there and force people to pay the tax. The Whiskey Rebellion, though, was a problem. But George Washington and the founders knew how to raise money non-coercively. There are plenty of non-coercive ways for us to raise funds to pay for public services. But if you want public services, maybe we can find charitable ways to do it instead of hitting each other over the head and forcing people to do it.
Well, so back to the fair tax and dotting the i's and crossing the t's on how you bring about a national consumption tax is abolishment of the IRS. And imagine our lives without the IRS. I do believe that this is government force at its apex. It affects all of our lives, and it affects all of our lives in a really negative way. So back to dotting the i's and crossing the t's on how you accomplish it. One is abolishing the IRS. Another of the caveats is making sure that the 16th Amendment is repealed, allowing for income tax in the first place, because you don't want a consumption tax to be an add-on tax. And let's not forget that the income tax started out as a flat tax, and look what it's morphed into. If we eliminate the IRS, if we eliminate income tax and corporate tax, we will issue pink slips to 80% of Washington lobbyists, because that's why they're there, to garner that special tax favor.
So I just want to say one thing. My problem with the fair tax has always been that if you have a tax at point of sale, let's say you buy a computer. If you buy a computer, you sometimes buy the parts from many different retailers. So you might end up spending $10,000 on a computer instead of $2,000. So there are a lot of problems with talking about a national consumption tax. And from a theoretical point of view, libertarians should not be talking about laying new kinds of taxes. Congress never gets rid of one tax and places in another. They might say, well, President Johnson, we're going to sunset the income tax, and we're going to give you your national sales tax, and then they're never going to sunset it like they never do. So I don't think we need to be talking about any new kinds of taxes. Cut taxes only.
Governor Johnson.
Well, I'm going to always sign on to making things better. So if it's a flat tax that reduces tax, I'm going to sign on to that. So I'm not married in any way to the fair tax. I just think it really is a good way of going about this. I'm not operating in a vacuum. I've got the entire staff at Chapman University, free market economists that have gotten behind my effort, Jeff Myron. And what they'll say is that this is really the best way to reform the system.
Thank you. Having spoken about the federal income tax and a flat tax, if it were to come to a flat tax, would you eliminate all personal and corporate deductions?
Yes, all personal and corporate deductions. Everybody pays the same rate. People like to talk about equality in this country. We should all be paying the same rate. If any of us have to pay taxes, everyone should have to pay taxes. There shouldn't be deductions if you have a child, if you get married. That to me is favoritism. If you want to have true equality, everyone should have to pay the same. There should be no deductions or loopholes, because rich people don't have to pay taxes. And that's the problem, is that it ends up being the middle class who pay the unfair share. Did you know that only 27% of people who are supposed to pay taxes actually pay them? So there's a 27% compliance rate. If you had a flat tax and people actually knew how to pay their taxes, maybe you'd have a higher compliance rate. Then the liberals would actually be happy because you'd get more revenue.
Crony capitalism is alive and well in this country. And so when you say, should you eliminate all those deductions? Absolutely, if you're considering a flat tax. But the reality is that this is what Washington lobbyists exist for. And this is the way that income tax started in this country, was a flat tax with no deductions. That's the way it started, and look what it's morphed into. I just suggest that Washington lobbyists do have too much influence, and you want to cut their head off? Eliminate income tax and corporate tax and the IRS, and you'll cut their head off.
That brings us to our next question. What federal departments would you abolish?
A couple come to mind. One is the Department of Commerce. I don't see the value add at all. And the Department of Commerce, in my opinion, is just crony capitalism epitomized. I mean, it's all about protecting American interests in lieu of free market. And I really do think that there is a magic to free market. The Department of Education. I would eliminate the Department of Education. And for those of you that take on this argument occasionally, here's the argument, is the Department of Education gives each state 11 cents out of every school dollar that every state spends. But it comes with 15 cents worth of strings attached. So it's a negative. They say you have to do A, B, C, and D, and here's 11 cents. And the states suck it up and spend 15 cents to comply with getting the 11 cents. Another thing is that everybody thinks the Department of Education was established under George Washington, when the Department of Education was established under Jimmy Carter. And tell me if there's been anything value added about the Department of Education since then.
How many people would agree that the Department of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms ought to be a grocery store? Not a federal agency. Why do I have to pay $200 to put a suppressor on the end of my AR-15? That's ridiculous. It's none of their business. The Second Amendment wasn't for hunting, ladies and gentlemen. The Second Amendment was meant to protect against tyranny. So the Department of ATF, they can go. The DEA, they're done. Gone overnight. That's another unconstitutional agency that we can get rid of. The rest of them are going to take time. They will require congressional action. We can rein in the EPA. The EPA does need to lose their enforcement branch. Why do we have bureaucrats with guns? It's ridiculous. The Department of Agriculture owns submachine guns. People ask me, do you believe in gun control? And I say, yes, I think that we need to control the government's use of guns. So there are a lot of agencies I think we can do away with. Let's start with those.
Continuing down the concept of fiscal responsibility, the United States is in debt to the tune of $18 trillion. The federal budget has not been balanced for most of the last 40 years. Do you believe this is good or bad?
Well, I believe it's bad, and I would be proposing, and by proposing, it has to be congressional, but I will tell you, when you propose, you get your legislators, in this case you get Democrats and Republicans that would agree with that same notion, and get that legislation proposed. To do that, like I say, you've got to take on the entitlements, Medicaid, Medicare. Social Security is absolutely fixable, by the way. Just a couple of really tweaks to Social Security, raising the retirement age. You could have a very fair means testing. How much did you pay in? How much should you get more out of Social Security than what you paid in if you have a certain level of income? I think that that would be very fair. And also to be able to self-direct those funds. So,
the reason that the United States has a national debt is because of a dirty deal done between Thomas Jefferson and Alexander Hamilton. Alexander Hamilton wanted the U.S. Capitol to be in New York, and Thomas Jefferson wanted it to be in Virginia because he didn't like the long carriage rides from Monticello. So he sold out to Alexander Hamilton and said, yes, you can have a national debt as long as I don't have to ride all the way to New Amsterdam, at the time, now New York. And this is how we got the national debt. We're still paying debt from World War I. We have not paid off the debt from World War I from the early 1900s. This is a burden that we place on our children and our children's children and their grandchildren. That's selfish. We've got to cut back on spending and we've got to cut back on debt. Now here's something else you didn't know. After World War II, everyone says, well, didn't World War II get us out of the Great Depression? No, World War II did not actually get us out of the Great Depression, because when you force people into conscription, you get full employment. Yeah, well, but then you get nothing to eat back home because there's no one to farm the wheat. This is economics. But when it comes to national debt, oh, they're going to cut me off. I had a great story, but yeah, cut spending, cut taxes. It happened after World War II, and we flourished.
change directions just slightly and talk about regulation. According to Randy Johnson of the U.S. Chamber of Commerce in a speech given in early 2012, over the past 3 years, the bound edition of the Code of Federal Regulations has increased by 12,000 pages. Over the past decade, the federal government has issued almost 38,000 new final rules according to the draft of the 2011 annual report to Congress. As president, will you continue this trend? If not, how will you rein in the bureaucracy?
I guarantee you that trend.
Governor Johnson, could we let him go first this time? Thanks.
Ah, the gray, dull bureaucrats. These are the people who crave uniformity. These were the A students who wanted to rule over us. Yes, I think it's time we stop the tyranny of the A students, the honor students. It's time for us to rein in the bureaucrats. The president can do some of this through executive orders. Like I said, you can end the DEA overnight, but federal regulations come from Congress, and the best way to get rid of them is to use the power of the veto. Calvin Coolidge, who I think was one of the greatest presidents, said that it is far better to kill bad bills than it is to pass new ones. So if the president just obeyed the Constitution, that would probably be the most libertarian president in history. So let's have another Calvin Coolidge. Nominate me and you'll be cool just like Coolidge.
So, as governor of New Mexico, I did this thing called Open Door After 4. The third Thursday of every month, I saw anybody in the state of New Mexico starting at 4 o'clock in the afternoon on 5-minute increments until 10 in the evening. And you would be amazed at what I found out when it came to rules and regulations and how they were affecting ordinary people, because they actually had a forum that they could go and present this to the governor. I think it made a huge difference. As President of the United States, I would have an open door after 4 for waste, fraud, and abuse. And I think it would be, as governor, open door after 4 was one of the best things that I did. It gave me a knowledge, an inside knowledge of how government affects people. Given that venue, I would create the same venue as President of the United States, and I think the results would be remarkable.
The next question hits very close to home to us Oregonians. The Western states have at various times fought a battle known as the Sagebrush Rebellion. This has been exacerbated in recent years by the action of various alphabet soup agencies such as the BLM. Here in Oregon, a ranching family has been prosecuted, convicted, sentenced, and resentenced under a federal terrorism statute. Do you believe that this was appropriate use by the president's administration or an abuse of power? And would you, as president, pardon the Hammonds if you believe it to be an abuse?
I would absolutely consider a pardon of the Hammonds. The government is acting tyrannically. These ranchers have been free grazing for 100 years. They're not harming anyone, and I think that it's absolutely horrible the way that the government has treated this family. So I would absolutely consider a pardon. But consider this. Now, there's a tertiary lesson in this story, because when the students in Berkeley had a sit-in, they all locked hands and they sat down, and the local government came by and casually pepper sprayed them all until they went away. But when the Bundys stood their ground, they pointed rifles at the federal agents and the feds backed down. When you have a Second Amendment in this country and you use it, that is the power of the citizenry. So I'm absolutely in support of the right of the Bundys to free graze. The federal government needs to sell that land now, immediately. Sell it all. They have no right to own it. And under my administration, I would conduct the largest land auction you have ever seen.
I may tell you all something that you don't know, but for the most part, we understand this west of the Mississippi, and that's BLM land. BLM land is laid out like a checkerboard. I mean, as in laid out like a checkerboard. Red squares and black squares, and they're geometric. They're the same size. So when you look out over the horizon and you see that the rancher has 10,000 acres, 5,000 acres of which are leased from the federal government, that's red squares that are being leased as opposed to the black squares that are owned. So when they pass legislation in Washington that says you have to have access to public lands, how do you provide that in that kind of a setting? We should be selling off BLM lands, but we should distinguish between BLM lands, public lands, and national forest. I think we should distinguish between the two, and yes, we should be selling off the assets of BLM land. Regarding the Bundys, as President of the United States, I would absolutely consider that pardon, but I'm curious to know what the particulars are. I don't understand the particulars here to categorically say yes or no.
Mr. Peterson, I allowed him a little additional time to finish his answer. Do you have anything you'd like to add?
Well, sure. I mean, I love our national parks, but why not just let the states run them? Why does the federal government need to manage our national parks? I love Yellowstone, and I love visiting these things. But the essence of libertarianism is private property. And private property is what we need to aim for. That is the centerpiece of libertarianism. So I'm perfectly fine with the auctioning off of these federal lands. I don't think that the national government should be in the business of subsidizing citizens to go to these national parks, as beautiful as they are. You still have to pay an entrance fee to go in. So why can't we just use that money privately, have that money be privately used?
A follow-up question in the same vein. The 10th Amendment is short and clear when it states the powers not delegated to the United States by the Constitution nor prohibited by it to the states are reserved to the states, respectively, or to the people. As president, would you restore the 10th Amendment to its rightful place in the pantheon of the Bill of Rights?
Absolutely, and even more important than the 10th Amendment is the 9th Amendment, because what the 9th Amendment states is that the founders knew that there were more natural rights that existed than they could even write down. Alexander Hamilton said, you don't need to write down those Bill of Rights, but the Anti-Federalists were like, well, the government is definitely going to overstep it, so let's write out a few of these rights. But the 9th Amendment was written so that we understood that our natural rights were expansive, and that and then in the 10th Amendment, it solidified it by stating that the powers that were not specifically enumerated to the federal government belong to the states and then to the people.
I think the concept of state rights is that you'd have 50 laboratories of best practice. Best practice would get emulated by other states. Failure would get avoided, but you end up with spectacular success. You end up with failure as a result of that. So just an absolute firm believer in states' rights and letting the states blaze the way. Back to the 17th Amendment. If the 17th Amendment were to have never been adopted, you would have had senators in Washington standing up against any infringement on states' rights, and this ends up to be a real cause. Our elected term limits, our elected representatives, senators, congressmen that go to Washington, there's something in the water that they want to control everything, and they want to control all of it for our good. Well, let the states do it. Let the municipalities do that.
I want to say one thing because I think this is so important. It's intrinsic to our belief system. States don't have rights. Only individuals have rights. States have powers. And only those specific enumerated powers in the Constitution can the federal government act. And sometimes a state can be even more tyrannical than the federal government, such as we saw during the Jim Crow era, such as we have seen with the push to outlaw gay marriage in some of the states. Some of these rights that we have, in fact, many of those rights, specifically the ones discussed in the 9th Amendment, those are numerous, and the states do not have them. They only have specific powers. States do not have rights. Only people do.
Johnson, would you like a few minutes or a few seconds? seconds to rebut?
I don't think so.
Okay. Let's go to the Second Amendment. It reads, a well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free state, the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. Is this an individual right or a militia right?
The Constitution of the United States does codify an individual right.
I think it's his turn to start first.
Okay. Yeah.
Well, I believe in the Second Amendment. I believe that the onslaught right now against the right to bear arms, that if it were enacted, I think that criminals will end up with the guns, that it won't be the law abiding. Our America Initiative, we're standing up on a regular basis for when they call for limiting the caliber of a weapon. When they're calling for a certain number of rounds in the chamber. We're standing up and saying, no, that this shouldn't take place. As governor of New Mexico after Columbine, Governor, what do you do to prevent a situation like Columbine in the future? I said, you're not going to like the answer. You're not going to like, what is it? What is the answer? You're not going to like it, but it would be the requirement, and I'm not suggesting it, it would be the requirement that teachers would have to have weapons in their desks.
First, a little bit of history. Originally, the Constitution only limited the powers of the federal government, and the understanding was that the states could write all the anti-libertarian laws that they wanted to. As time went on, the Second Amendment, and along with others, have started to become incorporated into the states. So this is a legal question and something that we need to discuss and understand. But let's talk about a little bit more history. George Washington's hunting buddy, a guy by the name of George Mason. You ever heard of George Mason University? They were best friends. And at the Constitutional Convention, the question arose, what does this militia clause mean? And George Mason stood up and said, I ask, sir, then what is the militia? It is the whole of the people, except for a few public officials. Which meant that it was an individual right to bear arms, that we are the militia, and that it is the public officials that need to have their gun rights restricted. So the Second Amendment is expansive and it is individual.
Our next question is about the First Amendment. What application does the First Amendment have to such contemporary issues as marriage equality and the right of businesses to refuse service on religious grounds?
Well, I don't think, on the basis of religion, and I absolutely recognize the freedom of religion, but I don't think that freedom of religion should be an excuse to deny service to anyone. That is, as a business, best practice. The theory is that in practice, if a business refuses service to individuals, that the marketplace will respond by not doing business with that business. I just think that if civil rights legislation weren't enacted in the 60s, that you would still have segregated bathrooms today in the South, and that you would still have service being denied by business to blacks in the South. I believe that. Under freedom of religion, and just, there's equality, and I would suggest that equality is service to everyone and that religion is blind.
I respect the governor greatly, but I fundamentally disagree. This is at the heart of the libertarian concept of private property rights. Should a Jewish baker be forced to bake a Nazi wedding cake? That's ridiculous. People should have the right to refuse service on their own property. And it's important for us to defend this right, even when it's unpopular. What's popular is not always what's right, and what's right is not always what's popular. So can we please defend our libertarian principles? If we're going to run a somewhat quixotic third-party campaign, let's fight for our principles, even when it's unpopular. I believe in freedom of religion, but let the bigots out the themselves. Let's know who they are so that we know not to frequent them. Are you going to eat a cake made by someone who doesn't agree with you, who's being forced to do it? That doesn't sound like a very smart idea to me. The Civil Rights Act dealt with the discrimination in government. It was only Title II of the Civil Rights Act that dealt with private property. And yes, I think it's horrible, and racism should never be tolerated in a free society. But when government steps in, there are unintended consequences.
There seems to be some disagreement here. Governor Johnson, would you like to have some rebuttal time?
Well, I'm just back to the notion that government should protect us from harm, whether that's individuals, groups, corporations, foreign governments. And I guess I put this in the category of doing harm, and that potentially someone denies me service. We were talking about this the other night, and I'm sorry that the examples aren't coming to mind, but I'll have to bone up on the next debate to give you a couple of examples of where you'd come down on the discrimination of certain individuals because of religious freedom. That
no one was ever harmed because they weren't allowed to have a wedding cake, all right? Maybe their feelings were harmed, but I'm sick and tired of this political correctness. It's time for us to stand up for our civil rights and our right to do business as we please. I believe in gay rights. I am a great lover of all of my friends and family who are gay, and I support their right to be married. But the truth of the matter is that when we let the camel's nose under the tent, you're going to let that camel in sooner or later. So this is a perfect opportunity for us to get conservatives to vote for us, by the way, because they don't want to do this. So let's build a coalition with people who disagree with the big government statists and progressives. Let's bring them into the libertarian fold on these issues.
Our next question is about immigration. Admittedly, by most, our immigration policy is a mess. How would you like to see it changed as president?
Well, I think I'm going to restate what I've stated before. Let's embrace immigration. We're a country of immigrants. Let's make it as easy as possible for somebody that wants to come in this country and work to get a work visa. The reason that there are illegal immigrants in this country is because the line doesn't move to come across the border to get jobs that exist. So you're in Juarez, you know that jobs exist in El Paso, but you can't get a work permit, you can't get a work visa to go over into El Paso to take advantage of these jobs, but you know even if you cross illegally, then that in fact you can get these jobs because these are jobs that Americans don't want. So let's make the line moving to get across the border. Let's not put the government in charge of quotas. That's a mess. There'll either be jobs or there won't be jobs. And right now, there's a reverse migration taking place. There are more jobs in Mexico right now than there are in the United States. So we see a lot of these illegal immigrants going back to Mexico to get these jobs.
Thank you.
Let's build a wall around Donald Trump and make Bernie Sanders pay for it. What do you say? You know, immigrants come to this nation because they want a land of opportunity. Let's open that back up again. Give us your poor, your tired, your huddled masses yearning to be free. The Statue of Liberty, that which we represent. Let's embody these principles boldly and hold up the torch of liberty. That's our logo. So let's be that welcoming nation again. Let's have a simpler path to naturalization. You know, a lot of times immigrants who come here to the United States, they end up giving us more in service than they take away. Most people don't understand economics is not a zero-sum game. Just because I come to work for you and I take your money doesn't mean that I'm stealing from you. If I come and I buy something from you in a shop, for example, we both say thank you. I say thank you, you say thank you, and wealth is created. So when immigrants come here and they work and they have jobs, they are creating wealth in the form of labor. Labor is a form of wealth, so we need to have a simpler path to citizenship. Stop sending students back overseas after they come here and are educated. We need to have a simple, easy path to naturalization.
We have 3 more questions, but I can see that the bottom end is probably getting a little tired. So I'd like to give you an opportunity to stand up and stretch for a moment, and then we'll take these last 3 questions. Stretch a little. Take a sip of water.
Hey, thank you for streaming this tonight. Yeah, thanks for letting me. Yeah, this is really. I always like the opportunity to stream whenever I can. Hey, Al, I remember chatting around on there. We'll talk more. I know what you're going to ask me about. We'll talk more offline here. Hey, haven't seen you in a long time. How's it going? Good to see you. Good.
Well, I'm well. You guys going to be...
All right, thank you very much. Great. Take your seat again.
You're supposed to sit down.
Yeah, okay. Good seeing you, man.
Our next question is going to be... It's about trade agreements versus treaties. The president has the power to negotiate treaties on trade and other matters. The North American Free Trade Agreement, NAFTA, and the much newer Trans-Pacific Partner Trade Agreement have long-term consequences for our nation. President Obama claims that these are not treaties and thus do not require congressional approval. Do you agree? And do you support such agreements?
Another act of tyranny from our tyrant-in-chief, President Obama. This is ridiculous. Oh, I have not read the entire text of the TPP. You know, we were talking about intellectual honesty and being honest earlier. I haven't read the full text of the TPP yet. I'm like halfway through it. So until I've read the entire thing, I can't say whether or not I think it's a good thing or not. NAFTA, I have read. NAFTA, I think, has been decent. Most of these free trade agreements end up being managed trade agreements, so it becomes a trade-off, a lesser of two evils. That's what governing is most of the time. It's choosing between a lesser of two evils. Thankfully, if you get to choose between Governor Johnson and I, it's not a lesser of two evils. You've got two goods here on stage. So I hope you will nominate one of us. Governor's a great man, and of course, if he wins, I will support him. If we have trade agreements like the TPP, they absolutely must be ratified by the Senate. That's what the U.S. Constitution says. Obey the Constitution. We do not need executive agreements that bypass Congress. That's what the point of Congress is. They should be reining this guy in. Well, he should have been impeached a long time ago, but that's another discussion.
So you're asking this question to somebody who may have vetoed more legislation than the other 49 governors in the country combined. This is a piece of legislation, any sort of trade agreement, that I would view with absolute skepticism. That isn't to say that the agreement doesn't make things better, but usually this kind of an agreement is just laden with crony capitalism. It's laden with whomever is able to lobby for the special interests that get represented by these trade agreements. I'm the free market guy. I really believe that, look, if China is going to subsidize the goods and services that they send to the United States, who benefits from that? You and I as consumers of those products. And let's consume as much of it as we possibly can, and at some point it will correct itself to the detriment of China. I realize that there's some mining agreements that come to play.
Thank you. Switching gears, Iran and North Korea appear to be foaming at the mouth to annihilate other nations, including us. South Korea, Japan, Israel, as well as other countries are at significant risk. What course of action or actions would you pursue in these situations? Governor Johnson.
Well, I think that the leader of North Korea is nuts. Having watched a few films of North Korea. So I'm really leery of what's happening in North Korea. As President of the United States, I will tell you that you will be able to assemble the leading experts in government as to what is happening and suggested course of action. And I would be no wallflower. I would not want to militarily intervene whatsoever, but I do think we're dealing with someone here who is really whacked. And that would be what I would take into that meeting. I would take into that meeting a whole lot of skepticism for what is their end game, and I would be open to whatever course of action would protect, in my opinion, if it came to protection, protect the world from what I think he is capable of doing.
So the latest intelligence estimates that I've read about North Korea's capabilities are that they have intercontinental ballistic missiles, which theoretically could hit the United States, the continental United States. Los Angeles are targets, as well as Alaska. These are real threats that we will absolutely have to deal with. But as President of the United States, your job, number one job, is a diplomat. Your job is an ambassador. So you can't go around calling dictators crazy and hope that you're going to have some form of diplomacy. North Korea is a humanitarian crisis waiting to happen. China does not want them to destabilize because they don't want them fleeing to the north. South Korea, obviously, we have a DMZ, but I think that we could look at renegotiating our treaties potentially there, because I do believe that South Korea is strong enough militarily to protect themselves. And I know this because I have received intel and briefings from people who are on the ground there who are advising me on my campaign. So we need a wait and see, we need a conciliatory approach, but we should not be subsidizing these foreign regimes with foreign aid. And that's it.
I wanted to get back to the freedom of religion for a second.
Go ahead. It's your debate.
Okay, so what about a public utility? All right, by a public utility that's privately owned, denying service to a person. Pardon me?
Side, is it public or private?
Privately owned, providing public service, in this case, the
Granted
utility.
monopoly by government.
Pardon me?
Granted monopoly by government.
Right.
Please let the candidate answer the
No,
question.
no, right. But that's my example is a public product used by everyone that because I own that service that is provided to everyone, I'm going to cut off your service because of my disagreement with you on the religion that you have.
So, Mr. Peterson, would you like to revisit that question?
Can you ask it again?
Well, actually, it was a whole new, he went back several questions to one of commercial rights. You know, as a private business, would you allow people to not sell to others?
Absolutely, absolutely. It's your business, you own it, it's your private property.
Well,
That's the centerpiece of
And
libertarianism.
not to get crossways, because you've made your points excellently. What would you do, though, with regard to a utility providing electricity to a community where the owner said that he would no longer provide service because of religious belief?
Follow Ronald Reagan's advice. Fire them all and privatize it. Privatize all the things. We don't need the government in the utilities business any more than we need them to build roads.
Not the government, but a private, and I'm not
I'm sorry,
arguing with you.
I'm confused by the question.
I'm not arguing with
Yeah.
you here, Austin. I would just like your take on it, really.
If a private utility.
Well, private utility, yes, but the only utility, the only provider of that service is denying service to an entire category of people because of their religious beliefs.
I'm sorry, but fundamentally, you do not have a right to the product of someone else's labor.
But your electricity is hooked up. You've got electricity, and if
And the liberals
they're
will
not
say
going
that
to give
the
you your
internet is a right,
electricity.
that we need net neutrality, Governor, so that because some people are going to cut the flow of the internet. I know you supported that measure. I think it's ridiculous.
Cut the flow of the internet.
You're talking.
Never.
Yes, you said that you supported net neutrality.
No.
You said that on our
Uh-uh.
side with that you think that some bandwidth providers are going to cut bandwidth from one to another. Net neutrality is socialism for the internet. We do not need to
Yeah,
have those.
no, I never
conversations.
supported net neutrality.
Okay,
Never.
so
Never.
you might want to log into iSide with and change those questions, or the answers to those questions, because I
Well,
think a
that
lot of people are
wasn't-
confused.
Well, and
But no,
I apologize.
I took the I sided with quiz a couple weeks ago, and I sided with myself 90% of the time. So there are some issues that I sided.
I would give private charity to help those people who are in need, but I would not force a business owner to do it because that is tyrannical.
But what if it's electricity? And there's no other way to get my electricity than through the electrical co-op that is not really a co-op, it's
You have to
or
have
the
faith in
electrical
the free
provider.
market because people are charitable. That's the thing. In Hurricane Katrina, they were talking about price gougers. They had no electricity. So guess what happened? People brought generators in and they were selling generators. They were not only just selling generators, they were selling them from states away. Why? Because they were able to sell them at an astronomical price. They called them price gougers.
I'm going to have to call a close to this.
Let the free market work.
We have to debate. It took us a long time to get to that debate.
We're nice guys.
I have one last question. If elected, you will face opposition from both major parties. How will you deal with that opposition to implement policy change? And if I may add, the whole issue of gridlock. How do you deal with that?
How about a president that's going to challenge Democrats on what they're supposed to be good at, which is civil liberties? I mean, really, historically, aren't they supposed to be good on civil liberties? And then how about challenging Republicans on what they're supposed to be good at, which they're not good at all, which would be dollars and cents? Neither party is good on either topic, but you could actually, I think, as a Libertarian president, I think you could shame them both into seeing some really significant improvements to our country. I mean, everybody talks about gridlock. Well, it's gridlock because a Republican proposes something. One of the biggest surprises I had in politics was that I really thought that Democrats and Republicans at the end of the day were going to vote for what was right as opposed to what was Democrat and what was Republican. I think this is a great opportunity to be in the middle and call them both out.
Right, the governor's at the heart of the matter. You take a look at the chessboard as it lies. If Republicans have a majority in Congress, then you work with them on spending cuts and tax cuts. If Democrats have a majority in Congress, you work with them on ending the federal war on drugs and other associated items which you agree with Democrats on. Find the libertarians amongst the group. There are quite a few of them. And if one of us is elected president of the United States, we will need libertarians to send us good legislation. People like Massey and Amash in the House, and Cruz and Hall and Lee in the Senate. So it's all a matter of tactics. And so you have to nominate someone who understands these strategies. This is classic art of war. Attack the enemy where they're weak. Do not attack them where they're strong. So this is a basic left-right strategy. Again, depending on who is in control, work with them on the issues that you agree. And of course, gridlock, is that really such a bad thing? You know, is it really so awful? Sometimes gridlock is good.
Thank you very much. We are now at a point of having our closing statements. The timers will give each of you a minute and a half, and you will get the green light at 1 minute and the red light at a minute and a half. And we start with Austin Peterson.
Ladies and gentlemen, about 6-7 months ago, I saw our cause starting to falter. I saw many of my friends who wanted to be insurgents in the Republican Party fighting a losing battle. And my heart wept for them because I wished the best for them, but I knew that I could not help them because I was a member of the Libertarian Party and that's where I would stay. So any support that I had voiced for Senator Rand Paul's candidacy at the time was one of well-wishings to my friends, with a hope, like Governor Gary Johnson did, that he would eventually see the light and join the Libertarian Party, which I'm glad he's done. And I've been a Libertarian since 2008 when I worked in your national office advancing these principles, and I've got a long way ahead of me. Giving me this nomination now is an investment that pays dividends, because I will be there the day after the election. I will be there every day for the next 10 years and the next 10 years after that. Everyone who knows me, they call me the Freedom Ninja, because I fight for liberty. And that's what I'm going to do. And if I win this nomination, I'm going to create a process by which other libertarians can win as well, because everyone who's running as a libertarian for office right now is able to call on me and seek my professional advice so that I can help them win their battles. My battle is much more difficult, but if I can help the little freedom ninjas out there across the country win theirs, then I will consider this a great victory. I have a real plan to build coalitions with conservatives and reasonable Democrats. And there are people out there who are desperate to give us our vote. There are media professionals who are desperate to write the story of an underdog. I'm the underdog. I'm the anti-establishment candidate in this anti-establishment party. The revolution continues. Let's keep up the fight no matter what happens. Thank you so much.
Governor Johnson.
In 1972, I remember getting a book on what it was to be a libertarian. I read that book and immediately realized, well, this is what I am, a libertarian. And then the book said, well, if you believe in this, pass it on to somebody else that they may know the same. First time I voted for a libertarian presidential candidate was Bergland against Reagan in the second term, because Reagan just spent so much money. There's a lot riding on this election. Right now, I think that Hillary and Trump are the two most polarizing figures in American politics today. I think that they fully represent 30% of the American electorate. I think the majority of people in this country are libertarian. They just don't know it. So there is a very real opportunity to be in the presidential debates in the general election. And that really ends up to be something that all of us need to consider. I mean, who gives the best voice to libertarianism? Who potentially has that opportunity? And I think that this opportunity is unprecedented. I think we have an opportunity here to change politics in America like never before. I'm suing the Presidential Debate Commission. Bruce Fein is suing the Presidential Debate Commission. Bruce Fein's biggest claim to fame is that he brought Nixon down in Watergate. He follows that up with the sentence, he said, but this Presidential Debate Commission lawsuit is the biggest thing that I've done in my life.
First off, let me say thank you to you, the audience, who have sat here patiently and listened to both of these gentlemen share their views with you. So give yourself a round of applause. Secondly, I am impressed that we could have a civil discourse tonight without calling one another nasty names. So
I was waiting for a hand stroke.
round of applause. With that, I'd like to turn it back over to Mr. Richburg.